George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. His presidency from 2001 to 2009 was anything but ordinary. It was a time of immense change marked by both triumph and tragedy. Bush, a Republican, came into office promising a humble foreign policy. He pledged to focus on domestic issues like education reform. However, fate had other plans. Bush's presidency took a sharp turn on September 11, 2001. This horrific terrorist attack on American soil redefined his presidency. It thrust the nation into a new era. The world watched as America under Bush's leadership responded to the attacks. The war on terror began. Domestically, Bush faced other challenges. Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast. The 2008 financial crisis shook the nation's economy. These events tested Bush's leadership in profound ways. They also left an indelible mark on his presidency. Through it all, Bush promoted his vision of compassionate conservatism. This approach aimed to blend conservative values with a more empathetic approach to social issues. It was a defining aspect of his presidency, but its impact remains a subject of debate. September 11, 2001, a date etched in the memory of every American. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon shocked the nation. They exposed America's vulnerability. They also revealed its resilience. The images of that day are seared into our collective consciousness. The collapse of the Twin Towers, the smoldering Pentagon, the heroes who risked their lives to save others. These images are a stark reminder of the human cost of terrorism. The attacks had a profound impact on America's psyche. They shattered the nation's sense of security. They also ignited a wave of patriotism. Americans came together in grief and solidarity. They sought solace in their communities and their faith. The Bush administration faced the daunting task of responding to the attacks. They launched the War on Terror, targeting Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. They also implemented new security measures at home. These measures included the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The War on Terror became the defining foreign policy initiative of the Bush presidency. It was a global campaign against terrorism. It involved military action, intelligence gathering, and diplomatic efforts. The first phase of the War on Terror focused on Afghanistan. This is where Al-Qaeda had its base of operations. The U.S. launched airstrikes against Taliban targets. The Taliban was the ruling regime in Afghanistan and a supporter of Al-Qaeda. The U.S. also deployed ground troops to Afghanistan. They worked with Afghan allies to overthrow the Taliban regime. This initial phase of the war was successful. The Taliban was removed from power. Al-Qaeda's infrastructure was disrupted. However, the War on Terror expanded beyond Afghanistan. The Bush administration argued that Iraq also posed a threat. They claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They also suggested links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. This decision remains highly controversial. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. The invasion led to a long and costly war. It also destabilized the region, creating a power vacuum that groups like ISIS would later exploit. Domestically, Bush campaigned on a platform of compassionate conservatism. This approach sought to temper traditional conservative policies with a more empathetic approach to social issues. It was a departure from the more stridently conservative rhetoric of the Republican Party in previous years. Compassionate conservatism manifested in various policy areas. One example was education reform. Bush championed the No Child Left Behind Act. This law aimed to improve education standards and accountability in public schools. Another area where compassionate conservatism was evident was faith-based initiatives. Bush believed in the power of faith-based organizations to address social problems. He created the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. This office channeled government funding to faith-based organizations. They provided social services like drug rehabilitation and job training. However, compassionate conservatism also had its critics. Some conservatives saw it as a betrayal of core conservative principles. They argued that it expanded government and blurred the lines between church and state. Liberals, on the other hand, questioned its effectiveness. They argued that it did not go far enough in addressing social problems. Section 5, Hurricane Katrina, a leadership test. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast. It caused widespread devastation. The storm surge breached levees in New Orleans, flooding much of the city. The federal government's response to the disaster was widely criticized as slow and inadequate. Images of the flooded streets of New Orleans, with residents stranded on rooftops and chaos engulfing the Superdome, became symbolic of the failures in disaster preparedness and response. The storm exposed racial and economic inequalities. It also raised questions about the government's responsibility to its citizens in times of crisis. Bush's handling of Katrina became a defining moment of his presidency. His initial response was seen as detached and out of touch. He was criticized for praising FEMA Director Michael Brown, saying, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," while the crisis was unfolding. The Bush administration eventually acknowledged the shortcomings in the response to Katrina. They implemented reforms to improve disaster preparedness and response. However, the damage to Bush's reputation was done. Katrina cast a long shadow over his presidency. Section 6. The 2008 Economic Collapse, a precipice for America. As Bush's second term ended, the nation faced its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The collapse was triggered by the housing bubble burst, subprime mortgages, and major financial institution failures. Millions lost jobs, homes, and savings. The stock market plummeted, erasing trillions in wealth. The Bush administration responded with a $700 billion bailout and a stimulus package. Critics argued these measures rewarded Wall Street and neglected ordinary Americans. The crisis contributed to Barack Obama's election as Bush's successor. Section 7. Retreat from the public eye, a life after the White House. After leaving the White House in 2009, George W. Bush largely retreated from the public eye. He returned to Texas, where he established the George W. Bush Presidential Center. The center houses his presidential library and museum. It also hosts policy institutes and leadership programs. Bush has pursued a variety of interests in his post-presidency. He has taken up painting, publishing a book of his portraits of wounded veterans. He has also remained involved in charitable work through the Bush Center. He focuses on issues such as global health, education reform, and supporting military veterans. Despite his relative silence on current events, Bush has occasionally spoken out on issues of national importance. He has called for immigration reform. He has also expressed concern about the rise of political polarization and the erosion of democratic norms. However, Bush has notably refrained from commenting on the presidency of his successor, Barack Obama, or the subsequent Trump administration. This silence has drawn criticism from some quarters, who argue that he has a responsibility to speak out against what they see as threats to American democracy. Section 8. The Shadow of Trump, a legacy in question. The presidency of Donald Trump cast a long shadow over George W. Bush's legacy. Trump's brand of populist nationalism, his attacks on democratic institutions, and his divisive rhetoric stood in stark contrast to Bush's more traditional conservatism and his emphasis on compassionate leadership. Bush's silence on Trump's presidency has been a subject of much debate. Some have interpreted it as tacit approval, while others have defended it as a sign of respect for the office of the presidency. Regardless of his reasons, Bush's silence has left a void in the Republican Party. This void has been filled by those who embrace Trump's brand of politics. The Republican Party of today is a far cry from the party that Bush led. It is now dominated by Trump's supporters. They often espouse views that are at odds with Bush's own. This raises questions about the future of the Republican Party. It also raises questions about the legacy of compassionate conservatism. Bush's legacy is complicated and contested. He left office with low approval ratings. He was blamed for the Iraq War and the botched response to Hurricane Katrina. However, he is also remembered for his leadership in the aftermath of 9/11. He is remembered for his efforts to promote education reform and combat HIV/AIDS globally. Section 9. The Future of America, a Nation at a Crossroads. As America moves forward, it does so with the lessons of the Bush presidency in mind. The challenges of the 21st century, from terrorism to climate change to economic inequality, demand thoughtful and compassionate leadership. They demand a commitment to democratic values and a willingness to engage with the world. The future of America remains unwritten, but the choices made today will determine the course of the nation for generations to come. It is up to all Americans to honor the sacrifices of those who came before us. They must work together to build a more just, more prosperous, and more peaceful world for all. The story of America is a story of progress and resilience. It is a story of triumph over adversity. It is a story that continues to be written every day. The Bush presidency, for all its complexities and contradictions, is a part of that story. It is a reminder that even in the face of great challenges, the human spirit endures.